Tonight, the question of the day, a federal judge overturned the voter ID law in Texas, saying he found it to be discriminatory to minorities. But isn't it insulting to minorities to suggest they are somehow incapable of obtaining government IDs in order to vote? In just moments, Gretchen von Helms weighs in. Then the reaction to Rachel Dolezal claiming she's transracial is very different than the reaction aimed at Caitlyn Jenner when she announced she was transgender. So what's the difference? And former Trump advisor Carter Page revealed to be the target of a FISA court surveillance order. But Carter Page never met with Trump. He was never paid by Trump. Even under surveillance in the Russian probe, where's the smoking gun? Thanks for being here tonight. As you know, our nation is at a tipping point. We either turn America towards liberty or we risk losing her forever. So let's get started. Our first tipping point tonight, isn't it insulting to minorities to suggest they're somehow incapable of obtaining government IDs in order to vote? A federal judge overturned the voter ID law in Texas, claiming it was racially motivated, intended to discriminate against minorities who either don't have government IDs or don't have access to get government IDs. Now, this ruling, it's a victory for the left, who for the past decade has claimed voter fraud simply doesn't exist. But in a nation where over 130 million people voted in the 2016 presidential election, it's naivete bordering on simply moronic to suggest that nobody cheats. It's also insulting to minorities to insinuate they're somehow incapable of obtaining a government ID. But that doesn't stop the left. Joining me now to break it down, attorney and Democratic strategist Gretchen von Helms. Gretchen, good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, Gretchen, let me pose this question of the day to you quite simply. Isn't it insulting to minorities to suggest that they're somehow incapable of obtaining government IDs that they would need to vote?
No, it's not, and I'll tell you why. Because identification costs money, and what this judge ruled is that is it equivalent to a poll tax. You can't charge people to vote. And if you know, passports are expensive. And to get an expedited passport if you don't have one, if you need it to vote, that's even more expensive. And also it costs to get other types of government-issued ID. It is interesting that the Texas rule said, well, you could have a license to carry a gun, that could count, but a student ID didn't count. So that's why this judge found that there was a discriminatory intent behind the law, and we've known that to be true throughout.
Right, and I guess that the intent part is interesting to me. It seems to be a new sort of fashion among federal judges to rule on the intent of the law rather than the letter of the law itself. But if you look at the facts here, Gretchen, it doesn't even line up, because if we're looking at the racial demographics here of people who don't have government-issued IDs, like you said, not student IDs, government-issued IDs. This was a study by Reuters, actually. Black people, 3% don't have government IDs. White people, 2% don't. I mean, that's barely a difference in percentage-wise. It doesn't seem that it's targeting a certain racial demographic who's less likely to get an ID.
I understand your point, and there was actually going to be then more numerically white voters who don't have identification. But what this law targets, this was with black and white, but the problem with this law is to enact a poll tax, enact strict requirements for people to vote, which is contrary to our Constitution, and the right for people to vote, to go to the polls and to express their opinions by voting for candidate A or candidate B. The impact has been shown to severely be adverse to people of color, people who are, and that's because of social economics. A lot of times people of color are less economically well off than their counterparts.
Right, but that argument, that's what I'm saying. The Reuters study kind of nullifies that argument, because it's not really adverse to people simply because of their skin color. If in fact this Reuters study is true, and that it's just a 3% of black people don't have government IDs versus 2% of white people, it doesn't really adversely affect them based off of their race here. But let me pose this in a different direction then. You say that it's contrary to the Constitution to have a poll tax, to have to pay something in order to exercise your constitutional right. Why do you have to pay to get a concealed carry permit then? That's a constitutional right too, right in our Second Amendment, yet we have to pay in order to exercise that right.
Again, that's a separate legal challenge. This legal challenge was for voting rights. So you have the right to vote, and there shouldn't be a poll tax, and that is what this judge indicated in the opinion. The judge also indicated that the discriminatory intent of the legislature, how they enacted this law, was found to be discriminatory, and she has ruled on this on 2 separate occasions. There have been multiple other courts who have ruled on different aspects. Different judge on a different part in Texas ruled that it was discriminatory. So
Right, but you understand the discrepancy
precedent.
coming from the left. You understand the discrepancy coming from the left. It's not a consistent legal precedent, or it's not even consistent the way that they advocate for it, because they're advocating at the same time to go back to the Second Amendment, which is a clear constitutional right. We can carry personal firearms. That's been upheld 2 different times by the Supreme Court. You have to not only pay to get your permit, sometimes you have to pay to get a background check. How can liberals advocate that it's okay to have to pay to exercise that one, but it's not okay to have to pay to get a government ID, which, by the way, you don't always have to pay if you can't afford it. Sometimes states have programs set up where you can get a government ID for free. Does that inconsistency not bother you?
I'm not addressing the Second Amendment at this point. I mean, I believe that both the Second Amendment and the Fourth Amendment and the right to vote, all of those should be treated similarly so that the citizens have those rights to either carry a firearm if they wish to, certainly to vote. What we're talking about here today is the voting rights, and that has to be, say, look at it from the conservative point of view. If the conservatives are so upset about having to pay to hold a license to have a gun, why are they not similarly upset that it's costing somebody to vote? Voting is a fundamental right, just like the Second Amendment. This right is to protect the people's ability to go to the polls and make choices about who they want to govern them. That's a fundamental right. It's been decided,
right,
and they should be able to do this without this extra burden of having.
No,
to
no,
have
and I can answer the
and
question. I can answer the question about the conservative viewpoint about voter ID, and it's because, it's exactly what you said. The right to vote is a fundamental bedrock to our republic. It is the way that we govern ourselves, not just some elite in Washington governs us, rules over us. And when there is the opportunity for voter fraud, when there is abuse of that system, it takes away. It could negate entirely my vote if someone who doesn't have a right to vote or someone who's trying to game the system cheats me out of my vote. There's nothing more fundamental than protecting, that importance, the integrity of our vote. And we know, we have evidence that voter fraud does happen. How widespread it is, we don't know, because people don't have IDs to be able to prove it. But just the fact that the integrity is at risk, isn't that worth protecting?
It's absolutely worth protecting, but there, again, is no study which says there's any widespread voter fraud. That has always been a red herring of the conservative movement, to say, oh, there's this widespread voter fraud. Therefore, we need to have laws to protect against it, but there is no evidence of it. If there were evidence of widespread voting fraud, and those studies are capable of being performed, they have been performed, and what they show is it's smattering. Do people defraud? Of course. Do people go get gun licenses that shouldn't, that have mental illnesses or are addicted, that shouldn't have guns? And we've seen that. Mentally ill people have gotten a hold of guns.
Right, but let me push back on this. Because I'm not sure how we could possibly know how widespread voter fraud is or not. I'm not just sitting here saying, it's blanket widespread voter fraud, but how do we know if people don't have IDs? How do we know if they are who they say they are? How do we know that they're not gaming the system? We can't know. And I want to bring up some things. Not the controversial study, that people were using to defend Donald Trump when he was saying there was 5 million fraudulent votes. But here are some other examples that I've pulled. James O'Keefe, he's identified instances of voter fraud multiple times. We don't know how widespread those tactics that he's discovered could be, but they did include someone saying that they bust people in from out of town to vote. That should concern us all, I think. Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, he said that there is voter fraud. We simply don't know how widespread it is. And then, Gretchen, there was a bipartisan commission at American University. It was actually co-chaired by former President Jimmy Carter that found that there was, in fact, voter fraud. But again, we don't know how widespread it is. If we don't have IDs to verify people's identities, how do we know?
You can do empirical studies that go to the exit booths, that ask people what they voted for, if they had identification, if they were required to present it, if they don't have identification, why not? We have the ability to conduct those statistical studies, and my understanding is that some have been done and have not indicated widespread voter fraud. I didn't prepare that material for this talk today, but there is the problem with assuming without doing the research, and we're capable of doing the research. The conservatives are capable of doing it. My understanding is they've done it. They don't like the results because it doesn't support their position.
No, the study I have here, this was done by Jesse Rickman and David Ernest at Old Dominion University. Forgive me for interrupting just for a moment. This was done in 2008 and 2010, before the era of Trump, before those allegations of voter fraud. They found in those 2 years, 14% of non-citizens said they were registered to vote. Now, if we are just talking about illegal immigrants here, not just non-citizens who are here legally. I mean, that's 11.5 to 12 million illegals in our country right now. 14% of 12 million, that's 1.6 million non-citizens who would be registered to vote. That's indication enough that, I mean, hopefully you and I agree those types of investigations should happen. But I want to make one final point, ask you one final question before we run out of time, and that's proof. When you talk about people being denied the right to vote because they can't afford an ID, Democrats don't come with a number. They don't say this many people were disenfranchised, this many people were denied their right to vote. I mean, if you look at what people need IDs for in order to operate in our society, it's almost everything. So how many people actually are being disenfranchised by voter ID?
Well, the Democrats did do that, and in fact, in this particular law, they proposed other IDs that are completely valid, such as school identification, wherein kids that are over the correct age but are in school have identification that's provided to them by the school, and they were not allowed to use those to vote. And they said, look, this is going to be a problem for minority voters, young voters. A lot of the youth coming up is there's a more population with minorities of younger people, and so based on that, they said use these to get around the problem. You're not going to have this problem if you use these other forms of identification.
Right, and I mean, I guess the argument, I guess the defense there would be that student IDs don't say whether you're a citizen of the United States, whether you have a right to vote. One last statistic that I do want to share with viewers here, and that is in the state of Indiana, this study was done by the University of Missouri. In the state of Indiana, the election after they implemented their voter ID law, the number of voter turnout, it actually increased. More people turned out after the voter ID law than before it was implemented. So that's fairly interesting. Gretchen, we're out of time. We'll have to talk about this again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.